Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa alihi tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The school of thought, Shiism, for example, it has its roots in the Quran, in Ahadith. And so, when we talk of a school of thought evolving, there are two ways one can look at it. God forbid they may say that the actual school is changing and evolving. And that would mean even they may attribute that evolving nature to the Quran or the Ahadith. But the more likely understanding is that when you say a school of thought is evolving, you mean that people's understanding of that school of thought, which has its roots in the Quran, people's understanding is evolving. That would be much better, because people are limited. People compare how they think and perceive today to 50 years ago, 100, 500, 1,000 years ago. You only expect, it's only natural to expect that the manner of perception evolves and gets stronger and stronger over time. If the manner of perceiving was the same as 1400 years ago, that wouldn't be a very good sign. But we have to refrain from saying that the school of thought is changing itself. There's no guarantees, and there's no need to say that, let's say 1400 years ago, that what we know of Islam is the whole of Islam 100%. No one could make such a claim. And there's no need today to say we have understood 100% of the Quran. It doesn't really make sense to say such a statement, because then there's no point in trying to perfect oneself. One can only expect that as one progresses and the intellects evolve, they will understand the Quran more and more. That's why it would be a deficiency to say, I've understood all of the Quran now. And when you look at the philosophers during the centuries, the Urafa during the centuries, all these different scientists within the sciences of Islam, you see in every science it's evolving. If this is established, then it becomes, in quotes, suspicious if during the first early period of Islam there's a way of thinking, then as a result of people's perfection and their way of their perceptions, they improve on their understanding of the Quran, and then after a period of time some people claim, oh, the original Islam has been attacked. They've changed the original message. And this is what has happened. That during the early centuries, people had an understanding of Islam, and they weren't all the same. And then as the centuries progressed, and people's perceptions of the Quran became better and better, for reasons we'll come to in future sessions, then some people said, oh look, true Islam was in the 1st and 2nd century by XYZ scholar, and what these scholars are now saying, it's the perverting Islam, it's not true Islam. True Islam was the scholars of the 3rd century, the 4th century, and so on and so forth. You see, there's a problem here. And books like Crisis and Consolidation by the respected Hossein Tabatabai, who used to have a chair in Princeton in America. I'm not sure what he's doing now, but he's a scholar who, at least I can say, he's more scholarly than me, that much I can say. Or the likes of Kadiwar, who used to be in North Carolina. They've introduced a certain understanding of Islam which, at least we can say, it's very surprising. And we'll speak about these because these have been written in English, they have their works in English. This theory of Ulamaa Abrar, which they've raised, it's not a very holistic understanding. And what they're claiming is very difficult to digest. Now I will share with you some of their writings and what they're saying, and you have access to their books yourself. But some things they say it's very difficult to accept. For example, one of them has written, and I'll read it one day, that the concept of ismat was introduced by Hisham ibn Hakam, who was in the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Before that, there was no mention of ismat. And they contributed to this idea of ismat. I mean, this kind of thing, it's something incredible for someone to say that. And why would you want to say that? What's the agenda here? So, when we have the Quran, that's the absolute. And so when ismat can be extrapolated from the Quran, this is a criterion for us to know that these things haven't suddenly changed after 1 or 2 centuries. They were always there, but people's understanding of them wasn't always uniform. And this is something very important, and we're going to try and open a few areas. Although the original discussion I want to do is in relation to ilmul ghaib, knowledge of the unseen. That's the main theme in the next 2 or 3 days. But for today, there's some general points I want to mention before we get to the specific ilmul ghaib aspect. When the scholars have divided the time of Islam into 3 broad categories, they say we have the time where there were the imams, let's say until the minor occultation. And the second period is from the major occultation to the 7th century after Hijrah. And the third period is from the 7th century onwards. Now, the scholars who are doing this, they want to highlight how Islam has the understanding of people, how it's evolved during these 3 phases. So they have a particular reason why they divide it into 3. This classification isn't definitive. Maybe you find historians or other scholars who divide it in other phases. That's okay. And here in the first phase, where it's the time of the imams, Islam was supervised by the imams. They were in control of the pulse of Islam and how Islam is to progress. They were supervising everything. And during the time of the imams, they would give commentaries of the Quran, and how they understood the Quran, how the commentaries the imams would give, they would extrapolate and give statements, but it was all from the Quran, either the Zahiri dimension of the Quran or the Batini dimension of the Quran. And then they would give these statements, and these statements became ahadith. So when we say ahadith, they're extrapolated from the imams, from the Quran, not from outside the Quran. But the Quran isn't limited only to the Zahiri aspects. The Quran has a batin also, and that batin has a batin 7 times over. Anyway, these ahadith that are given, we have to speak about it. I mean, how these ahadith have been relayed and transmitted from that time to the succeeding times, and that's a science in itself, and we'll discuss that also, inshallah. But right now my focus is that even during the times of the Imams, there was this difference in understanding of Islam. They wouldn't all think the same. The tawheed of the disciples of the Imams was different. The concept of nubuwwat, of prophethood, was different. So there was a difference in the levels of understanding of the basic pillars of Islam, but there were differences in how they would understand. Especially after the Holy Messenger, there were a lot of differences in relation to the Imam himself. There were some disciples and companions of the Imams who would say after the Prophet, the Imams, they received no inspiration, no angelic intermediary, and all that they had is what they received from the previous Ma'soom. So Amirul Mu'mineen, for years and years, was taught by the Prophet, they say. So as the Prophet was active during the day, at night he would teach Amirul Mu'mineen. This was something, and the names of these disciples of the Imams who had this, it's been recorded. They said there was no, after prophethood, the Imam only had that knowledge which they acquired from the Holy Messenger, and for example, Imam Hassan from Imam Ali, Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam, and one after the other. It was a kind of acquired knowledge they had from, and ultimately it would be from the Holy Messenger directly in the case of Amirul Mu'mineen, indirectly in the case of the others. So this itself would pose a question that many of the Imams, for most of their lives, they weren't in contact with their father because their father was taken under house arrest. They were separated from their children. Or sometimes the child, at childhood years of age, became an Imam. So how would they answer with this? They would certainly limit the status of Imam when they say, no, after prophethood, any source of inspiration, divine inspiration, any source of angelic intermediaries, any kind of revelation, it's a no-go area. That's only for a prophet. And after a prophet, they weren't accepted. This was, the majority were thinking like this in the beginning, after the demise of the Holy Messenger. Things which today, me and you would say, good grief, that's very rudimentary. But, you know, the Prophet was there for 23 years. And after the Prophet, it wasn't as if everyone was thinking very highly, in high perceptions of what an Imam is. And even the event of Saqifa would show that. When you see a majority, claiming who should be the successor, it just shows you how much they've understood who the Imam is. Otherwise it shouldn't have been such an easy event to have taken place. So this was one understanding, that this is how they would understand who the Imam is. So it's like someone who has the knowledge, but it wasn't something supernatural or metaphysical in nature. And they were a majority, maybe. There was another group during the time of the Imams too. Now, during the time of the Imams, it's a 250-year period. This group, which started as a majority, after 250 years, it was a minority. even during those 250 years, people's understanding would change in relation to the Imam. But the Quran was always there as a backing to prove their point. They would understand in reality, therefore, the Quran more and more. And that aided their evolution in perceptions of the Imam. There was a group, also disciples, companions of the Prophet, who would say, no, there is a degree. There's no revelation, but there is a degree of divine inspiration. And they may even relate with angels too, but they don't see the angels. They can hear the angels. So this is they were a bit more informed as to the status of the Imam, but only to this degree would they accept. So after the Holy Messenger, they would say, no, there is a degree, but it's limited. And the names of these companions too are delineated in the books of history, and in the ahadith. We'll mention one or two tonight, inshallah. And then there was a third group. They would say there's no difference with the Prophet except one. With the end of the Prophet, legislative revelation came to an end. But divine inspirations, angelic intermediaries, all this they had. And they would see, they would hear the angels, and they had everything which the Prophet had except legislative revelation. The Quran was the last book, and legislative revelation came to an end. But other forms of revelation continued. Even Lady Fatima alayha salam, the Archangel Gabriel would come to her. She would see, hear him, say what she's listening to, and Amir al-Mu'mineen would be the scribe, the Mus'haf of Fatima, for example, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and so on and so forth. And those who could see or speak with the angels, they would give the term muhaddath. And if you're female, muhaddatha. It's a degree of communicating with angels. So here with the third group, they really understood who the Imam was at a very good, in a very good way. But you can only expect that this minority, the third group, okay, they were blessed to understand who the Imam was, but it didn't go well with the others. The others were very uncomfortable with how they would describe the Imam. Now, in this book of Crisis and Consolidation by His Excellency Hossein Tabatabai, he says, in the first decades, this is page 30 and 31, in the first decades of the 2nd century, the most distinguished figure in this latter tendency was a profound Shiite scholar of Kufa, Abu Muhammad Abdullah ibn Abi Ya'fur al-Abdi. The most distinguished figure in this latter tendency. This latter tendency was a tendency, it's in the previous paragraph, a trend which denied or rejected any idea or report, hadith, that would attribute any supernaturality to the Imams, including claims about their knowledge of the unseen. There was a trend that any claim that the Imams had knowledge of the unseen, they would limit it or be against it. Or any idea of them being in contact with the supernatural realm, they would deny it. He is saying that Ibn Abi Ya'fur was the head of this group. And he was a very close associate of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq the author says. Then he continues, he Ibn Abi Ya'fur. It's an important name, at least if you memorize this name, because this name, as we shall claim, he is one of the running figures of the second group of the three groups we mentioned. So he believed they had some angelic intermediation with the Imams, had it with the angels. There was some inspiration, but it was of a limited nature. The author says he, Ibn Abi Ya'fur, was an especially devoted and faithful follower of the Imam, of Imam Sadiq. And he was, there's no doubt about it, and was praised by him as the only, or one of only two disciples of his who were the most obedient to him and with whom he was totally satisfied. Okay, that's a claim now. It's very difficult to prove that he only had two totally satisfied followers. And there must have been more, but it's not something to be too sensitive. But it's a claim which can't really be proven. But he was definitely a devout follower of Imam Sadiq, Ibn Abi Ya'fur. Then the author continues and says, in numerous statements from the Imam, Abdullah is praised with unusual and unprecedented complimentary phrases where he is said, for instance, to be living in paradise in a house between the houses of the Prophet and Ali. So look, here he's trying to say what a good figure Ibn Abi Ya'fur was, and he was. And he said this figure was a distinguished figure who denied supernaturality to the Imams or knowledge of the unseen. He was a figure, characteristic figure, who was against this idea that the Imams had any supernatural powers or knowledge of the unseen. But the author is here saying that this has Abdullah Ibn Abi Ya'fur has been praised by Imam Sadiq by saying, the Imam Sadiq saying, he's living in a house in heaven between the houses of Imam Ali and the Holy Messenger. So look, this itself shows that the Imam has knowledge of the unseen, knowledge of ghaib. This shows that he's connected with the supernatural. You see, it's a small inconsistency, but it becomes more. Then this is the point. He, Ibn Abi Ya'fur, maintained, however, that the Imams were merely righteous and pious learned men, Ulamaa Abrar. And this is where it all begins to crumble now. So, Ulamaa Abrarun Atqiya, yes, so of taqwa, pious, and Abrar, righteous. Merely, and we are going to go against this. Ibn Abi Ya'fur did not see them as this. But where did this confusion come from? Mudarrisi continues. He, Ibn Abi Ya'fur, once had a debate on this issue with Mu'alla ibn Khunais, another disciple of Imam Sadiq. It's a good name to remember because he is an area of controversy. He became an area of controversy because Ibn Khunais was of the third group, where the Imams are no different to the Prophet, except for the fact that they don't have legislative revelation. So you can imagine when Ibn Khunais has such an understanding of who the Imam is, people are going to be uncomfortable with him. Because not everyone thinks alike. Not everyone's intellect is uniform. So when Ibn Khunais speaks, some people may think the Imam was a Nabi, the way he is speaking. Imam Sadiq would always tell Ibn Khunais, and we have many traditions on this, don't do this. Don't reveal our secrets. Ibn Khunais wasn't very practicing in this instruction of Imam Sadiq. That we can gather from the ahadith. But more than once, Imam Sadiq kept on saying, look, we can't tell everyone who we are. People's intellects can't digest it. Then they may think we are a prophet. And then we would be responsible for this wrong thinking. I know who to tell, who not to tell. You stop telling these people this. Ibn Khunais would kind of open the lock of the chest, so to speak, the chest of secrets. And Imam Sadiq many times said, if you continue, they'll kill you. And he did become martyred by someone by the name of Dawood ibn Ali. I've forgotten his title. And Imam Sadiq saw that. And he was martyred. And when he was martyred, Imam Sadiq spoke very highly of Khunais and said he's in a place in heaven. Sometimes they may do an error, but they're good people. For example, Zayd, who committed himself to the uprising, the Zaydi movement, either directly or indirectly, Imam Baqir told him that it's better not to uprise. I don't want our Shias, our followers, to be killed. Now, this is Imam Baqir is saying this. He chose taqiyya here. But Zayd went ahead with the uprising. Many Shias were killed. Imam Baqir alayhi salam and even Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, when they spoke of Zayd and his uprising, they didn't go against him. Uprising was a good thing. It's a good thing they did. But it wasn't the better thing. This is where taqiyya has a very important role. And the legitimacy of taqiyya is rationality. And we'll speak about this one day. All the prophets before our holy messenger, they did taqiyya, including our messenger and the imams. But it's a rational obligation. It's when you want to improve or this movement of Islam, for it to progress better, sometimes the better option is to do taqiyya. But that decision the Prophet has to make. That decision the Imam has to make, not normal people. For example, that decision today that the leader would have to take, not any ordinary scholar. So the point was, Zayd's uprising wasn't a bad uprising, but there was a better option. He didn't commit himself, but they spoke very highly of him. Imam Baqir, Imam Sadiq, alayhim salam, they spoke highly of him. Khunais too, he should have kept it secret. There are some things you have to keep secret. If you bring it out, it's going to cause problems. And inshallah, one day I'll explain the environment of that time. It was a very specific environment. It wasn't like today. Everyone is free to do and say whatever they want. It was a very specific environment which was very oppressive and suppressive in nature. The Ahlul Bayt had a very difficult time. Anyway, so here, Ibn Abi Ya'fur, once had a debate on this issue with Mu'alla ibn Khunais. So this is an important name, Mu'alla ibn Khunais, because he belonged to the third group. And well, he opened the chest of treasures and people couldn't understand, and they said he is uttering qulu, these exaggerations in relation to the Imam. He's a ghali, one who exaggerates. And yes. Although qulu is a reality, it existed. I'll speak about it tonight, inshallah. But it existed, and we have examples. Although we'll speak about it later. But some people have kind of widened the scope of the number of qalis. They've done too much there. If they just would have kept it to the select few, and the qalis did a lot of damage to Islam. When you attribute deity to the imam, that's a problem. Or when you attribute lordship to the imam, it's a problem. These are ghalis, it's qulub. But sometimes you've understood the status of the imam, you explain it, and who they are, what they can do. Some people can't digest, they say he is ghali too. This was the problem. So here between Ibn Abi Ya'fur and Mu'alla ibn Khunais, there was a tension between them. Two very good scholars, two disciples of Imam Sadiq. And now here the author says this. So he, Ibn Abi Ya'fur, once had a debate on this issue with Mu'alla ibn Khunais, a servant of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, who ranked the Imams as prophets. It's not a good statement. It's not a well scrutinized and evaluated statement. The author, to say that Ibn Khunais, who was a very loyal disciple and who understood who the Imam was, who was in charge of the expenses and accounts of the Imam, who was one of the wakil, one of the powers of attorney of the Imam. How can you say he ranks the Imams as prophets? Forgive the expression, that's a cheap statement to make. You know, the enemies of Islam, although this author is not an enemy, don't get me wrong. This is an academic discussion, it's his theory. We shouldn't be scared when people have their own theories. Just because someone wants to express themselves and has this theory, we shouldn't suddenly go against them and reject them, and we have to speak with them. You shouldn't kind of separate them from your community. Yes, if these people, for example, speak slander or disrespect Islam in any way, that's another issue. But these people, we have to always assume out of their own sincerity, this is how they've understood it. That's okay. And now we want to go against their understanding. Now, these kind of theories, should it come out into the public? In my personal opinion, I think no. Because the average layperson may not be very learned in these different areas. So if you suddenly give them a soundbite, it may play around with their minds a bit. Or maybe there are some communities, no, the level of intellects are quite high. That's okay to share it with them. But this degree of responsibility, it's important that one has to see their audience. Anyway, now the Imam reportedly confirmed, so there was this area of contention between Ibn Abi Ya'fur and Ibn Khunais. Ibn Khunais said that the Imams are prophets, and the Arabic in the hadith he's mentioning, he says Al-Awsiya Anbiya, the successors are prophets. Who said this? Ibn Khunais said this. To who? Ibn Abi Ya'fur. Ibn Abi Ya'fur said, no, that's not correct. Al-Awsiya, the successors are Ulama'un, Abrarun, Atqiya. This theory comes from this one hadith. Okay? Now, what happened was, so they were waiting for the Imam to come. When the Imam came, before these two would even speak, okay, so this means the Imam had this knowledge beforehand. In the hadith, it says, and he's quoted the hadith, Mudarrisi. When the Imam entered the majlis, before these two even starting, the Imam looked at Ibn Khunais and said, look, whoever says we are prophets, I disassociate myself from them. So that's the hadith there. Okay. Now, let me see if there's anything else he's added. Yes, so he said the Imam reportedly confirmed Ibn Abi Ya'fur, what was on the side of Ibn Abi Ya'fur, and strongly denounced Mu'alla's idea that the Awsiya, the successors, are prophets. Okay, so this is one claim he makes. Now this idea, this hadith that he has mentioned, Kadiwar also has mentioned the same hadith. And then with this hadith, the conclusion they made was that the likes of Ibn Abi Ya'fur, they maintained that the Imams were merely righteous and pious, learned men. Ulamaa Abrar, Atqiya. Now the point here now is, look, you've taken one hadith. Ibn Abi Ya'fur has a number of other ahadith. Why haven't you brought those ahadith too? And we'll do that. And the second poison here is the way you're showing it. When they said ulama, when they said they thought them as merely ulama, the way you're purporting it and portraying it is that they were just scholars, like, God forbid, people like me. They were just scholars, but they were righteous. And here, this is where the problem is. The term ulama has a context to it. And if you just turn away from that context and the ahadith which highlight that context, and only choose one hadith and decontextualize it from the whole wealth of other hadith, you're going to come with a very corrupt, cheap philosophy and school of thought of Ulamaa Abrar. And then you say they have no connection with supernatural, the metaphysical, they don't have knowledge of the unseen, and so on and so forth. And as we shall try to show, that Ibn Abi Ya'fur wasn't of that belief, that they don't have knowledge of the unseen. And look how, just playing with terms here. What did the disciples of the Imams mean when they would call the Imam ulama? This has to be understood. What did the disciples understand in that time when they would say Abrar? And there's a hadith from Imam Hassan alayhi salam, whose birthday it was today, where he says, wherever there's Abrar in the Quran, it's referring to us. He said to the Holy Messenger, Amirul Mu'minin, Lady Fatima, me and Hussein alayhi salam. It's referring to us. And there are general texts and ahadith, like in Nahjul Balagha, where it says that فَحُكَمَاءِ ulama, the wise ones amongst the ulama, they are abrarun, atqiya. That the ulama, the wise ones, the hakim ones, they are abrar. That's a general statement. It takes many degrees. But when Imam Hassan says, Wallahi, wherever Abrar is in the Quran, it's in reference to us, it shows that the Abrar, there are degrees to them, the maximum manifestations of it are the Imams. But not Abrar just saying it means righteous, and in the same way it may apply to me and you, it applies to the Imams too. There are degrees to Abrar. So you can't put them all in one basket. Okay, now, here, this term, ulama, which is the plural of alim, it's also the plural of alim, but here alim is the main term we want to open up. we have to look at the ahadith on how the Imams have spoken about ulama whenever they mentioned alim. And have this in your minds, that after the demise of the Holy Messenger, if you were to say the Imams had knowledge of the unseen, access to the angels, many, and there were many, and they're noted in history, would say, well, they're prophets then. You couldn't, for many people, you couldn't tell them that the line of communication with the angels is continuing, but they're not prophets. People wouldn't understand it. And the Imams realized this. So look how they've classified certain terms, so that gradually this distinction between a prophet and an Imam can become digested. There's many ahadith where Imam Sadiq alayhi salam classifies people into three groups. He says there are those who are alim, which means knowledgeable. The second group, muta'allim, someone who is learning knowledge. And the third, those who are ignorant riffraff, so to speak. Those who, they don't care about knowledge at all. They have no, rectitude when it comes to knowledge. They're ignorant and so on and so forth. And there are many of these ahadith. It's not just a single one. And some of them, they don't give a definition. What does the Imam mean by alim? But this is what I mean. When you bring all the ahadith together and interpret holistically, if you just look at the other ahadith say that we are the ulama, the imams, and our followers are muta'allim, those who learn knowledge. So look, the hadith is interpreting a hadith here. But I'm saying the context, after the demise of the Prophet, they were encountered with this threat that people would think that we are prophets. So they said, no, we are ulama, it's us. We are the ulama. Look. This is how ulama became introduced. So in that hadith where Ibn Abi Ya'fur says they are ulama Abrar, don't say that it means merely righteous scholars. It has a history, it has a context. It's in relation to the Imams with their status maintained and preserved. And then there are other ahadith which say that the ulama are the inheritors of prophets. Al-ulama warathatul anbiya. And then at the end of some of those traditions says, we are the inheritors, the Imams are the inheritors. Now the nature of inheriting here, it's not a physical one-to-one. It's much more deeper than that. So that's another group of traditions we have. And then another group, Amir al-Mu'mineen, in one hadith, has said that after the Holy Messenger, people want to find authority, and they find their authority in three different types of people. One are, they find authority in the alim. Look, he's saying after the Prophet, when people want to say, who do we follow now, authority-wise? He says, some people, they follow the alim. And he defines the alim. One who is guided by Allah, needless of others, knowledge-wise. Look, there's a whole plethora of ahadith here. You just take one hadith and just come to a very cheap conclusion. That's not fair. Look, you do it with one hadith, we're doing it with 100 hadith. Which one's more accurate? There's a context here. There's a narrative here. Imam Ali, Amir al-Mu'mineen, is saying, look, there's some who they go to the alim. An alim is who's guided by Allah, needless of others, knowledge-wise. So here, the source of their knowledge is Allah, the alim. A second group are ignorant people who claim to have ilm, knowledge. Some people will go after them to find authority in them. But these people are ignorant. They claim to have knowledge, and you've fallen in their trap. And the third group, those who claim to be learned, but they've learnt it from the first group. That's also an authority for some people. So they go to someone who claims and says rightfully that my knowledge I'm giving you is from the first group, those who got it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so here, when you see the term ulama and alim used in this context, it doesn't necessarily mean just because the term ulama is given, it means you disassociate them from contact with the metaphysical realm. You disassociate them from being appointed by Allah. This is what they do. They said they were just merely ulama Abrar. They weren't appointed by Allah. They weren't ma'soom, and they didn't have knowledge of the unseen. These three, they maneuver around these three primarily. And they say, look, we have a hadith. And Imam Sadiq is cited with Ibn Abi Ya'fur, who said the awsiya, the successors of the Prophet, they are ulama abrar. But when you look at the term ulama used by the Imams, you see it in relation to them. But so why would they use ulama or terms like this? To make sure that people distinguish it so that they don't be called anbiya, they don't be called a prophet, but they still get their knowledge from Allah. They're still in contact with the angels, and so on and so forth. Salman is one example where even the Holy Messenger is saying, Salman min al ulama. He's one of the ulama. And that hadith where if Abu Dhar knew what was in the heart of Salman, Abu Dhar would have killed Salman. So Salman was of a very high degree, but Salman wouldn't open the chest of treasures. He was very loyal. Ibn Khunais was a bit less loyal than Salman. He opened the chest. They killed him. Salman lived a long life. Here, Salman was called one of the ulama. In other ahadith, Imam Sadiq is saying that Salman could hear the angels. Look. Ulama, he can hear some of the angels. Something which if you would say immediately after the demise of the Holy Messenger, people would say, oh, so they were prophets? Look, don't think it was a very difficult time. People's intellects weren't all the same. Imam Sadiq, in many traditions, when he describes Salman, he says, yes, Salman used to hear angels speaking, the whispering of the angels. And then some disciples of Imam Sadiq say, you too, can you do the same? Imam Sadiq says, observe your limits. Look, he wouldn't answer. Just observe yourself a bit. But to others, he would open it up a bit. You see? Yes. Now, so the ilm of the Imam was an area of contention for many of the disciples, because they want to see what is the source of the knowledge of the Imam. And depending on how you explain it, they may suddenly say, oh, well, they were prophets then. So these three trends existed. Some who say there was no contact with the supernatural metaphysical realms, no contact with angels, no contact with divine inspirations. There was a group though who said no, there was contact, but it was a bit more limited in nature, but they could see angels, they can listen to angels, and they weren't prophets, but they had this access to the metaphysical realms. And there was a third. Now, Ibn Abi Ya'fur was on the second group. This Ulamaa Abrar, which he said, not that he wanted to disassociate the Imams from divine appointment, Ismat or Ilmul Ghaib. No, he believed in this. And he would see the Imams say many things out of the unseen. But he belonged to this second group. But Khunais, Ibn Khunais was from the third group. Many would ask the Holy Messenger and the Imams, what is the status of the ulama? Because when you would say Salman is one of the ulama too, even the Holy Messenger would say that, the Imams would say it, they would say, what is the status of the ulama? And Imam Baqir came with this reply, like the one who accompanied Musa, the one who accompanied Sulaiman, and the third is Dhul Qarnayn. See, Yahduna bi'amrihi. Remember the Dhul Qarnayn, we said he had this providential order. We said Khidr had this providential order, which Musa didn't have. Asif ibn Barkhia had this providential order, bringing the bed from A to B in less than a twinkle of an eye. Khidr had things which Musa didn't have. Asif had things which maybe Sulaiman didn't have. Dhul Qarnayn had a providential order too. This is how they would, slowly try and teach people what the status of ulama is. Now in the Quran, it's explicit that the Imams yahduna bi'amrihi. But look, the mentality of people, it was difficult. Couldn't they have just said, look, it's in the Quran? Do we have to wait for the likes of Allah Metabotaboy? Of course not. But there's a context, there's a story. They want to bring all the people onto the same wavelength. You can't just give a soundbite. They can't understand everything in the Quran. Don't take, after 1400 years, now we are understanding many things. And even now, when you speak about the Imam, someone says, well, what about Allah? What are you going to say about the Prophet? Even now, people don't understand it, let alone 1400 years ago. These are difficult concepts. Also, there was someone, a companion of Imam Baqir came to him and said, was Amir al-Mu'mineen a muhaddath, one who has contact with the angels? And Imam Baqir said, do you mean if he was a prophet? Why would Imam Baqir say that? Because it was an area of contention. The way you would explain that Imam Ali alayhi salam or any Imam is in contact with angels, it was at that time an area of contention because people thought if you say that, they are prophets. Imam Baqir wanted to sort this out. What do you mean? Do you mean he was a prophet? And then he said no. And the Imam said no. He's not a prophet. He was like the person accompanying Musa, referring to Nabi Khidr again. It's a very important story, the story of Khidr in the Quran. It's very important. So Ibn Abi Ya'fur was of this group that, they believed that the Imam was ma'soom, had contact with the angels, was divinely appointed. But they limited it in certain ways compared to how the third group would see it. So when Ibn Abi Ya'fur says Ulamaa Abrar, we shouldn't think they were just merely righteous scholars. See, I'm trying to give you the kind of context here. This is what ulama meant. So it was a very important term. It had a lot of connotations attached to it. And you can't make a theory now. At the end of the day, just ulama abrar. No, that's not right. And I'll end here. I'm not sure what time it is. I think I've passed my time. But I'll end it. I don't want to kind of stop here. It would make it rather abrupt if I stop here. My personal question to the likes of Kadiwar and Modarisi would be, why did you suffice with one hadith? Wouldn't it be more responsible if you give other hadith too on Ibn Abi Ya'fur and his understanding of the Imam? Why did you just choose one hadith and then establish a school of thought, a way of thinking out of this hadith? And I want to mention two other ahadith here where Ibn Abi Ya'fur says that Imam Sadiq said that Amirul Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam was a muhaddath. Ibn Abi Ya'fur is saying this. Then he said, Ibn Abi Ya'fur, it would have been good if I would bring the Arabic hadith in Arabic and go through it. But like that, the amount we've covered now would have taken 5 sessions if I wanted to go through it. But sometimes going through the Arabic has advantages. Anyway, he said, then I asked Imam Sadiq, is there anyone amongst you like him? Like Ali, who was muhaddath. Muhaddath being, they had connection with the angels. They would hear the angels, see the angels, and so on and so forth. Are any of you like that too? So here, Ibn Abi Ya'fur is saying Amirul Mu'mineen is one of those who had contact with the metaphysical. This is explicit here. And he's intrigued to know whether the Imam Sadiq has the same too. That means he has an inkling that the same applies with Imam Sadiq. Because of those traditions that the ulama are inheritors of the prophets and we are the ulama. So he said, the Imam replied, Ali was muhaddath. Ibn Abi Ya'fur repeated himself, and anyone amongst you too, were they muhaddath? For a third time, Imam Sadiq replied, on the day of battle with Bani Qurayza and Bani Nadir, Jibreel and Mikael spoke with Ali from the right and his left, respectively, saying that he was muhaddath again. But he wouldn't tell Ibn Abi Ya'fur that he too was muhaddath, because he was of the second group. Maybe he couldn't tolerate that, like Khunais could. In another hadith, Imam Sadiq is saying, O son of Abi Ya'fur, the same scholar, Ibn Abi Ya'fur. Imam Sadiq is saying, verily Allah is one and essentially unique, and is unique in His command. The Arabic being mutafarridun bi'amrih. And He, Allah, created creatures and measured them for this purpose of amr. O son of Abi Ya'fur, we are those very creatures. Look, he's answering it, he's shedding more light on who we are. We are the creatures who were measured with amr, Allah's amr. We are those very creatures. We are Allah's proofs over His servants. And we are the storers of Allah's knowledge. And we have been established to execute this amr. Okay? Now this hadith saying we are executing Allah's amr. Now imagine, although this hadith is sound in its transmission, but imagine this hadith was not sound in the chain of transmissions. It's on a par with the Quran. Yahduna bi-amri. We have some scholars who went through Al-Kafi and they said we only look at the transmitters, if they're sound people or not. If there's one person in this chain of transmission who is not sound or trustworthy, we put the hadith away. Like that, they put more than half of Al-Kafi aside. Allahu Akbar, what was the agenda here? Why did they do that? What they did wasn't wrong. It was accurate based on their own thinking. That, yes, whenever there's a person who is not of reliable authority, and that hadith we just put aside. I'm going to speak about this in depth one day. And I have to do it with slides, explain the processes. But my question is this, that if there's a hadith and one in this chain of transmission is not reliable, but that hadith, the content is on a par with the Quran, why, by you putting this aside, you're doing a disservice here to the people. You can't just solely on whether the person, the transmitter, was reliable or not. That is not the only indicator to see whether this hadith is with proof or not. There are many other indicators. That's only one of them, whether the transmitter was reliable or not. There are hundreds of others. Look at it as a package, holistically, then you come and conclude. Here, this is very on a par with Yahduna bi-amrihi. We have been chosen to establish Allah's command. Who is saying this? Imam Sadiq. To who? Ibn Abi Ya'fur. The same person who says that Imam Sadiq and his likes are Ulamaa Abrar, but not like me, na'udhu billah. Ulamaa Abrar in this context. And so here you see that in that original hadith with Ibn Khunais was loyal to Imam Sadiq until the end of his life. And he became martyred. Imam Sadiq said he's in heaven. He's one of the inmates of heaven. So when Ibn Khunais, in that hadith where Ibn Abi Ya'fur is saying these are Ulamaa Abrar, but Ibn Khunais is saying Al-Awsiya, Anbiya. Of course he doesn't mean the Anbiya, that the Holy Prophet. Because if he did believe in that, he would exit the jurisdiction of Islam. That's problematic. Okay? It meant they had the qualities of the Prophet. They had the same manifestations of the Prophet. That's what Khunais believed in. Which means they had contact, they would see, they would hear the angels. The knowledge was from Allah. They had ilm al-ghayb, everything that the Prophet had. So there was certainly a difference, but not to say that Ibn Khunais really thought that they were a prophet who would bring legislative revelation. No. So this was the first point which I wanted to mention, and I think I'll stop here. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow with other themes. This Abrar is on a par with Ismat. That also has a context. This Abrar, where have they used the term Abrar? And inshallah, we'll talk more about this tomorrow. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala tahiri.